From the Center for the Study and Teaching of Writing at The Ohio State University, this is Writers Talk. I'm Doug Dangler. Today I'm at the Ohioana Book Festival on the Fort Hays campus, talking to authors here in the environs of the WCBE studios. So thank you, WCBE. And I'm talking to Frank E. Dobson, Jr., the author of Rendered Invisible, Stories of Blacks, Whites, Love, and Death. Welcome to Writers Talk.
Well, thank you for having me.
So tell me about your book. What is the story? What's the background?
Okay, it's basically a novella that is historical fiction, and in addition to that, there are several short stories. But the centerpiece is a novella, so I'll tell you about that. I'm originally from Buffalo, New York. I've lived in Ohio a lot of years, did graduate work at Bowling Green, have worked at Wright State University, et cetera, et cetera. But this piece is centered in Buffalo, New York. In Buffalo, New York in 1980, there was a little-known serial killer known as the .22 caliber killer. Now, the interesting thing about this guy, Joseph Christopher was his name, is that he wanted to kill African-American males, people who look like me, and those were his victims. 13 victims. Jeez. 13 victims in upstate New York, Buffalo, and in New York City as well. In Buffalo, he was known as the .22 caliber killer. In New York City, he was known as the Midtown Slasher. Now, the irony of it is that nobody knows about this killer. But of course, I grew up in Buffalo, so I would know. And so I really am talking about not only the killing spree and the victims, who I think were rendered invisible because the media never really picked up this case like it has with others more celebrated, or notorious is a better word, serial killers. But the other thing I'm looking at is the effect on the community, and indeed, not only on the community, but on individual families. And so what I end up doing is taking a couple of characters, and as a colleague of mine once said about historical fiction, the history is fact, but then the characters are fictional. And so I've got a couple of fictional families, one white, one black, who are trying to come together and help one another through this crisis and chaotic city. Because as the men are being killed, and the first victim is an African-American boy by the name of Timothy Dunn, who's a 14-year-old kid who was shot in the car as he was just sitting there. But what I do with the fictional characters is I give it a human kind of piece where this one guy, African-American, family man, wife, child, and a Caucasian guy who's married, family, and their families kind of know each other. They're coming together, backdropped by this crisis. And so I'm really looking at issues of race, issues of difference, issues of community by telling this story.
Okay. Now, several things are really interesting about that. One is that he goes from the .22 caliber killer to the slasher. Right. So he changes the mode.
He changes the mode of killing. In Buffalo, New York, actually the victims, the first four were African-American men who are largely sitting in cars or something like that. You know, the second two were actually cabbies, and very gruesome deaths with the cabbies. Their bodies were found and they were mutilated. The next series of killings, and he actually is a GI, and so at some point he reports to Fort Benning, Georgia, and all of this is documented and documentable. But after getting furloughed from Fort Benning in November of 1980, he gets a bus pass around Christmas time, goes up to New York City, and in New York City he's known as the Midtown Slasher. And because of the victims' throats were slashed.
So did he confess to this? How do they know that he was the one that did all this?
They actually, at some point, when he goes back to Fort Benning in January of 1981, he gets into a fight, predictably with a black GI. At some point, he's wounded in the fight, whatever. He's in the base hospital. And they actually hear him talking. I guess he's out of his head on drugs or whatever, and talking about how he'd actually slain several African Americans up in New York. Now, by this point, there's a massive manhunt. This is 1980, so our country is already in crisis because in 1980, as I do in the book, I talk about the Iran hostage situation, which is what's happening at that time. Remember, they had taken some of our ambassadors hostage. But in addition to that, I look at not only the Iran situation, but what's going on in the city of Western New York, or Buffalo, New York. In particular, George Bush Sr. comes to town. This is an election year. Ronald Reagan is running for president, and George Bush Sr. is his vice president. In addition to that, Jesse Jackson comes to town, and all of these luminaries have to deal with the city in crisis, and they have opinions on what's happening.
So they speak to the
public about it. They speak to the public about it. So I'm really trying to kind of capture the history, but in addition to the history, looking at how the community and the families, again, these particular families, come together to try to heal the wounds that have been opened by this.
Right. And in terms of a serial killer, I mean, I'm not terribly familiar, but I thought most of their victims were the same. You're talking about there's a kid and then there are men and there. So that seems sort of unusual in this case and hard to tie together.
Very hard to tie together. And at first, when the killings happen, there's not a sense of these are a series. There's one random killing here, like I said, of a 14-year-old. Then there's a family man who's killed, who's an engineer. Then there are a couple of cabbies killed later on, and one of the cabbies is 17 years old. So you've got a range.
Right.
And there's hysteria going on. At one point, and I did this, I talked about this earlier in a reading today, I was reading from a portion of the book where I talk about the fact that the African American community is obviously up in arms. And at some point, they want the federal government to get involved, not simply the local government, but the FBI. And the FBI does get involved. And the case that the FBI makes is an intriguing one because a couple of the victims are sitting in parked cars outside of restaurants. The feds are able to use the old civil rights legislation from the sit-ins, where, remember, the feds got involved because you had African Americans who were sitting at Woolworths counters and lunch counters and were denied the right to public access, i.e. anybody should be able to sit at a lunch counter. Well, they use that same legislation because these guys are killed while sitting in a public eating establishment, you know, in the parking lot. They use that to get into, you know, for the feds to get in. But that's a sort of interesting sort of linkage between this and the civil rights movement. And so I talk a little bit about the curious irony of that.
Okay. So what got you into writing? This is your first book?
My second book.
Second book. Where did you start?
Well, you know, as a writer, and you know, obviously you're in the media, I think there are always stories that need to be told. And so growing up, Buffalo, New York, African-American church is the notion of the testimony. Somebody's got something that they need to say. And it's important not only for them, but for others in the audience. And so for me, the whole notion of writer is testifying, witnessing, articulating a story that not only will be helpful to me, but hopefully helpful to other people. And so that's what got me going.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you've got, you said other stories in this, so you're doing multiple genres. You're doing a novella, you're doing short stories.
Yes.
What ties all that together? You just, there's sometimes there are stories that are, you feel have much more to be delved into than the short stories? Yeah.
Really, the theme is people trying to come together to create community. One of the stories, entitled Black Messiahs Die, is about a young African-American male who's going to be the next great African-American basketball player, a la LeBron James, Ohio's own LeBron James. But what happens is he gets shot by a cop right before the NBA draft. Right before he makes millions of dollars for the next shoe company and his agents. And so the agency gets involved, right? Because this kid's going to be worth 90 million, 100 million. His family gets involved. And so, and a young lawyer who's Caucasian American, who has befriended him, who's sort of a clerk for the agency, gets involved. And for her, it's not simply about the killing of Jonathan, who's going to be the next great young basketball player, but this was her friend. He was like her little brother, even though he was African American and she's white. And so it becomes personal. And I'm not only looking at issues of violence, but again, issues of community, issues of coming together, and I would argue also issues of exploitation, because she's questioning whether or not she wants to get into this business now.
Okay. So what is it that you're working on now? What's your next?
Oh my, I'm doing some scholarly things, but in addition to that, I'm working on another novel about an African-American gospel choir, sort of like The Big Chill, where, you know, people come back after a 20-year reunion and they've gone everywhere and done and all of that. So
Kevin Costner's dead in a casket at the beginning of it. Is that the okay?
Exactly, that kind of thing. That kind of thing.
Well, his career lately might support that. Sorry, Kevin.
Yeah, true.
You said you're doing some scholarly things. How are you involved in the scholarly things? I don't think we've gotten into your background that leads to that yet.
As I said, I did graduate work at Bowling Green, so I have a PhD from Bowling Green in English. So I do some scholarly work.
A PhD in English. I'm so sorry. I have one as well. That's
yeah, I know.
I feel your pain.
You know, exactly.
Kids, get your BAs. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, and then go make some money.
What's the scholarly work you're doing?
The scholarly work right now, I'm looking at a couple of pieces. One of which is looking at the image of the African American male, which is one of my issues, in contemporary film, but in contemporary film in leadership positions. There's a little known film called The Man, based upon the Irving Wallace novel, The Man, written in 1964 about the first African American president, who's impeached in the novel. Right. So I read that novel not too long ago, and I realized, okay, there's something there. But the interesting thing is that novel was made into a movie called The Man, starring James Earl Jones, 1972. But you can't find the movie. And the interesting and so I'm doing a scholarly piece on depictions of African Americans in the role of president. You know, but centering in on The Man, the movie, and the novel, because the interesting thing about the movie is that it was originally made to go into for TV, but they couldn't get any sponsors. This is 1972. You know, so sponsors are not necessarily going to want to back a movie about it, the first African American as president.
That's why you can't find it, because
that's why you can't find it.
Did it ever get broadcast, or was it?
No, sir.
No.
No,
Okay.
sir. So there are a few copies out there somewhere. So we're working on that.
James Earl Jones has got to have a copy somewhere.
You know, he's got a copy. Great actor.
Yeah. I tried to impersonate him. This is CNN, but it doesn't work.
Hey, you know.
Anyway, that's an old joke, because I don't even think CNN has voiceovers anymore. They can't afford it. Sorry, CNN. Anyway, I want to thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome.
Frankie Dobson, Jr., PhD, for being here on Writers Talk. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sure. And from the Center for the Study and Teaching of Writing at The Ohio State University, this is Doug Dangler saying, keep writing.